And good evening. We're doing it live right here, weeknights in the 5 o'clock hour in Los Angeles. Mottek On Money, 5 nights a week for you, live on the air right here on 790 KBC, streaming live online worldwide at kbc.com, and the on-demand Mottek On Money podcast at kbc.com, Apple, iTunes, and all your favorite podcast platforms. Well, as you heard Kevin Tripp tell us, the hot labor summer is spilling into autumn now, and there's some new developments here according to Deadline as the Writers Guild leadership and members move forward on the Scribes tentative deal with the studios and streamers. The 160,000-strong Actors Union, SAG-AFTRA, could be sitting down with the producers within days, riding the momentum that's hit Hollywood since the WGA and the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers struck a deal on September 24th. According to Deadline, SAG-AFTRA leaders have penciled in meetings with the Carol Lombardini-led group by the end of next week, according to sources talking to Deadline. Well, stocks ended the day sharply lower today. In fact, it was the worst one-day drop we've seen since March, back in the days when we were seeing bank failures. The sell-off today led by tech stocks as long-term Treasury yields rose to the highest we've seen, well, since 2007. And since about 16 years, the dollar climbed, by the way, for the fifth day in a row to a 10-month high. Consumer confidence taking a hit. This as gas prices continue to soar, especially here in Southern California. Oil's back above $90 a barrel. The Dow coming in for a closing loss of nearly 390 points. The S&P 500 down 64, and the NASDAQ dropped 208 points. Retailers back in focus, and what's euphemistically called shrinkage back in focus, also known as retail theft. Big box retail chain Target announcing it would close 9 of its stores across 4 states next month, saying that organized retail theft would threaten the safety of its employees and customers. The stores located in New York, Seattle, the San Francisco and Oakland area, as well as Portland, Oregon, will close on October 21st. We saw Target shares down about 2.5%. The National Retail Federation, meanwhile, released a report that found shrink represented $112.1 billion in losses last year, up from $93.9 billion in 2021. We saw some new readings on real estate today. Sales of newly built homes in the U.S. falling in August as interest rates and home prices stayed elevated, dampening buyer demand. We'll take a closer look at what's happening locally on real estate tonight in the Los Angeles area with CURT NORTHRUP, who leads the NORTHRUP Group at Compass in Beverly Hills, which specializes in luxury residential sales and investment. Meanwhile, rent's due. Eviction notices piling up in the Los Angeles area, largely because of non-payment of rent. The amount of back rent owed to landlords in L.A. is going even higher. We'll get an update on what's happening tonight with Daniel YUKELSON, the executive director of the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles. But first, joining us live now is Brian P. Brooks, partner at the law firm O'Melveny & Myers. He previously served as the top U.S. bank regulator. As former acting U.S. controller of the currency, he's at the top of the financial services and fintech world and has a total command of the subject on cryptocurrencies, which he can explain in plain English, and we love that. His most recent op-ed article in the Wall Street Journal focused on how to fight de-dollarization with stable coins. Brian P. Brooks, thank you very much for taking the call here this evening. You've kept us well informed on some of the biggest stories we've seen this year in the financial world, including several bank failures, the turmoil in commercial real estate, the big jump in interest rates, inflation, the big moves in cryptos, and your excellent Wall Street Journal op-ed article. Thank you very much for joining us, and give us your impressions here of this market sell-off today, and again, nervousness about interest rates and what's happening out there.
Well, Frank, thank you for having me. You've given a really great rundown of a lot of things going wrong at the same time. And, the stock market is now finally starting to price those factors in. The thing that I'm most worried about is some core basic issues, which are the same kinds of issues that brought us the great financial crisis of 2008. And a lot of that does have to do with interest rate policy and with chickens coming home to roost in the credit markets. So you just talked a minute ago about what's going on with residential real estate and how newly built home sales are falling off a cliff. Here's what I really worry about. Just 3 years ago, the average American was spending 28% of their monthly income in home payments, whether that's rent or mortgage payments. As of last week, the number was 42%. So 28% is pretty comfortable for most people. But when people are spending 42% of their monthly income on housing, that tells you 2 things. One is a certain number of those mortgages are going to start to default. And 2 is The loans that don't default are going to result in those borrowers pulling back spending in other areas. So that predicts both an economic slowdown and potentially a residential real estate, I don't want to say disaster, but a serious concern. Those are things we saw 10 years ago in the financial crisis. I hate to see them germinating again, Frank, but I think that might be what we're seeing.
On the air live with Brian P. Brooks, the former top regulator for U.S. banks. And let me ask you this, Brian P. Brooks, and of course, the commercial real estate sector got most of the attention and concern this year, and it's still a big worry, certainly in the banking world and in the real estate world. What's your assessment of the commercial real estate situation here at the moment?
Well, I hate to be the pessimist on your program every time I show up, Frank, but there is a fair amount of concern out there. So on the commercial real estate front, a couple things that your listeners need to know about. So one is commercial real estate disasters happen more slowly than residential real estate disasters, and that's because you have a mortgage default that takes place over 3 months. A given borrower misses one payment, misses the next payment, and on the third payment goes into foreclosure. So inside of 3 months how bad that situation is. These commercial real estate loans tend to be 10 years in duration, and so for the last 3 years of the COVID pandemic, we all kind of intellectually understood that office towers were largely empty, but we kept thinking that people would come back to work, and that's been going on for 3 years. The problem now is some of those commercial real estate loans are coming due, and it turns out people aren't going back to work. And so tenants in these buildings, the law firms, the insurance agencies, the banks, are paring back their real estate footprints dramatically, in some cases 50, 60, and 70%. And what that means is those loans where the borrowers were hoping that the buildings would fill back up are going to have to default. That's going to have to be their ultimate conclusion. And it's not just in the office tower space. I think a lot of people in LA will be familiar with the news out of San Francisco just 3 months ago that the only remaining shopping mall in the city of San Francisco, which had something like 300,000 square feet in the heart of the financial district, had the landlord, Westfield, just turn in the keys and walk away from the building, and that building will now eventually close. These are really bad signs, and they mean a lot of things. They mean losses to banks that are public companies, so people who own bank stocks are going to bear that brunt. But it also means that banks themselves are going to be much more wary of extending new credit to people in any area because they're taking massive losses here on their loan book, and now they're going to be much more conservative on the next loan they make. All of that is a vicious cycle, Frank. It makes it harder for people to take out new mortgages, makes it harder for small businesses to find loans, and it certainly makes it harder for landlords to find new financing for their buildings.
Well, is getting credit in that coal mine. The canaries are really adding up here. Thank you for that very important assessment of things here. And remember, during the U.S. Financial crisis, China was held up as was going to save the world with its funding and its stable real estate sector and all that. But now it looks like China's property sector is in meltdown, and that's impacting things as well. Give us your assessment here, and is that something that we need to be concerned about?
Well, it is an issue. I mean, like one of the things that's always held up the U.S. economy is consumer spending, and consumer spending depended on a couple things. They depended on cheap goods from China and Latin America, and COVID broke those supply chains, and of course, geopolitics also made it harder for us to trade with China. And then the other thing was, China financed its real estate boom largely through, cheap U.S. debt. So they were able to buy relatively high-yielding investments cheap, and that was a good way for them to store their money and then ultimately to finance that sector. One of the things we know now, as you just pointed out, is that's all changing in a lot of ways. Labor is not as cheap in China as it used to be because of demographic problems. Their economy in terms of supplying the U.S. is not what it once was for a whole bunch of reasons. And maybe most importantly, if you look at a graph of China's holdings of U.S. sovereign debt, that graph shows them selling. It shows for the very first time that I can remember a significant net sell-off in American debt, which means there's not a ready market for us to sell, our bonds. So all of these things add up to a very different global geopolitical environment that we've ever seen before, and the U.S. consumer may not be riding to the rescue this time.
And we're already seeing consumer confidence take a hit. This as gas and oil prices have moved up, and historically, as they move up, consumer confidence moves down. But certainly, there is a lot of concern out there, and obviously with inflation as well and rising interest rates, the Fed's still signaling another rate hike ahead. How much higher do you think rates are going to go, and what impact will that have on the economy?
Well, look, I think Chairman Jay Powell of the Fed has signaled he wants to be very, very careful about what he does. He does not want to over-index on rate increases, and that's why they took a pause at the last meeting. On the other hand, Frank, I don't know about you, but when I drive to my local gas station and I see that premium gas is $6.90 a gallon, this is a year after the administration declared victory over inflation, and gas prices are $6.90 a gallon, which is $4 a gallon more expensive than they were 3 years ago. And when you see that prices at the grocery store really haven't come down, I think a lot of Americans are asking themselves, what is it that the Fed is looking at when they say inflation has come down? So what that tells me is we have at least 2 more rate increases on the horizon over the next 6 months, maybe more than that, and maybe for longer. And that means all of the things we just talked about, the unaffordability of mortgage credit and those kinds of things will persist, which tends to have, recessionary pressures on the economy.
Not to pile on, but now we see credit card interest rates at record highs. Remember when inflation was last time was this high 40 years ago, at least credit card interest was deductible. Now it's no longer deductible, and now it's at a record high here.
Well, that's right. And of course, mortgage interest isn't as deductible as it used to be, which doesn't matter in the middle of the country where most people don't have million-dollar mortgages. But in a place like Los Angeles, where lots of middle-class houses sell for high 6 figures and low 7 figures, when you can only deduct $750 versus $1 million, that also starts to bite as well. So it's more expensive everywhere you turn, and that would explain a lot about the political mood of the country, not just the economy. People aren't seeing their day-to-day problem solved, and so the macro issues don't matter as much. If you're spending this much on mortgage, this much on food, and this much on gas, that's pretty much your own household economy right there.
On there live with Brian P. Brooks, the former top U.S. bank regulator, as acting U.S. controller of the currency. And let's get to the exciting stuff now on cryptos, which I have to say you are the best at explaining things in plain English. What are your observations? We've certainly seen the Bitcoin rebound from that crypto winter last year. It's pulled back from its high point of the year. But what about Bitcoin here at the moment and your observations on crypto this year?
Well, I'd say a couple things, Frank. One is on Bitcoin, and specifically, the believers in Bitcoin, the long-term holders of Bitcoin, which is most Bitcoin investors, by the way. Most Bitcoin investors never sell. They're in that asset because they have seen monetary policy, not just in the developing world, but even in the U.S., go off the rails. And their belief is, hey, it's not necessarily that the dollar is going to disappear, but it is, I need a hedge against a really bad outcome here. So the places that people really invest in Bitcoin are places like Argentina with its 140% interest rate, or Venezuela, with its almost incalculable inflation rate. But when you have 9% inflation in the U.S., as we had a year ago, it starts to make people think, gee, I need an asset that can't be debased the way that the dollar's been debased. So that's why Bitcoin, despite all of the other negative pressures on risk assets, has hung in there, in the high 20s over the last little while, I think. The other interesting thing in crypto, though, and you mentioned my op-ed, which I appreciate. The issue that I was dealing with in the op-ed had to do with a bigger issue, which is in other parts of the world, the role of the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency, by which I mean the currency that trades are settled in, that oil is priced in, that international commodities markets trade in, has been under pressure for a long time and is under even more pressure today. So just 2 weeks ago, there was a summit of the BRICS nations. This is China, Russia, Brazil, India, and South Africa. And those countries got together with the explicit purpose of talking about creating a trade pact among those countries. And think about it, those countries comprise about 3 billion people. Okay, so that's about a third of the world's population. And the idea was, let's start pricing our own trade deals not in dollars anymore. Let's find a way to either price them in our own home currencies or in the Chinese national currency or in a basket of currencies, but let's stop using dollars. And that's a scary idea. So I mention this because in my op-ed, I argue that there is a countervailing force in the developing world which has the potential to shore up the dollar if we're not dumb enough to screw this up. And that is something called stable coins, which are these internet-native dollar instruments. They're not dollars themselves, but they're units of dollars that are held in bank accounts, which can be held by people even in countries where their banks don't permit dollar-based savings accounts. So the concept is if you're a wage earner in a country like Argentina or some other country that has very high inflation, you'd far rather hold your wages in dollars if you could then hold them in your local currency, because if you hold them in your local currency, they're worth less tomorrow than they are today. Problem is, your local bank doesn't support dollar savings accounts. That's where stablecoins are right to the rescue. Stablecoins are things you can buy on your phone, hold in your crypto wallet, and they are redeemable for dollars wherever you happen to go. And so that is a way in which the blockchain economy is actually helping real people do really important things, namely save for retirement and protect against inflation. That's a real thing going on in the world, and incidentally, it's very good for the U.S. and our currency.
That is very interesting, and thank you for highlighting that. And given what's happened this year with FTX and all that, what do you see happening on the regulatory front, and what would you like to see happen on the regulatory front at this point?
Well, look, FTX set regulatory efforts back 2 years at least. And anytime you have a massive fraud, there's major retrenchment. So if you think about what happened in the early 2000s with WorldCom and Enron and companies like that, that led to massive regulation. Things like the Sarbanes-Oxley law and things like that came into effect because of that. And FTX created the same environment around crypto. It was a big fraud with a very visible bad guy at the center of it, and that's going to result in a certain amount of pain being inflicted across the sector. What I would tell you, though, is one of the reasons that FTX was able to happen was because U.S. regulators have persistently refused to impose regulation on crypto. It's a very perverse idea, because usually when you see something bad happening, if you see a lot of traffic accidents, you impose speed limits or you adopt airbags, But somehow in crypto, the idea is, if we were to impose market structure regulation or require that FTX use a certain kind of custodian or allow banks to compete with FTX, somehow people think that is validating crypto and that would be a bad thing. My personal view is FTX would have been prevented if you had the same rules for crypto that you have for stocks and bonds. The way I tell the story, Frank, is the way Charles Schwab won't steal your stock investments is because they don't have them. They're required by law to keep them in a separate custodian that's unaffiliated with Schwab, so that Schwab can't get its hands on your stocks and bonds. But there's no such law in the world of crypto, because the regulators are afraid that if they impose the law, it would somehow validate crypto. And so ironically, in trying not to touch crypto, our regulators have made it much more dangerous.
At what point do you think banks will be more crypto-friendly, and should they be more crypto-friendly at this point?
Well, look, it's like saying, should banks be more stock-friendly? The truth is there are value stocks and growth stocks and very, very risky stocks and penny stocks, and it's the same thing in crypto, Frank. There's some things that I don't think anybody ought to touch, and there's some things that I think are foundational long-term investments, and they're not all fungible with each other. But having said that, the really big news in the crypto space over the last 6 months is the decision by BlackRock, Fidelity, Franklin Templeton, and some other major asset managers to apply to the SEC for permission to offer crypto ETFs, exchange-traded funds, the kind of things that retirement savers could safely invest in, kind of like an index fund, except for crypto. Now, the SEC has refused to approve that, but the big news as of about a month ago was that a federal appeals court in Washington, D.C. overruled the SEC and said that, in fact, those ETFs are legally permissible. So that opens the way for regular retail mom-and-pop investors to get safe, diversified exposure to crypto in the same way that was a safer way for them to get involved with stocks and bonds 50 years ago. That's a big development. We're still on the front end, but believe me, once BlackRock supports something, the rest of the financial system will support it pretty quickly. Thank
you very much for highlighting that. That is very interesting, as has been this entire conversation. Wish we had even more time, and hope we can do this again soon. Always appreciate this tremendous insight from Brian P. Brooks, partner at the law firm O'Melveny & Myers, and previously served as the top U.S. bank regulator, as former acting U.S. Comptroller of the Currency under President Donald J. Trump. Thank you very much for taking the call live with us here tonight.
Thanks so much, Frank.
Thank you very much. And again, his op-ed article recently in the Wall Street Journal focused on how to fight de-dollarization with stable coins. And right now, let's get right out to the freeways here on 790 KBC. Friends, if you're injured in an accident, you need an experienced advocate, and Clark Fielding and his team of sharks at Fielding Law are on standby, ready to dive into your case. My friend Clark the Shark is fearless for justice and the go-to attorney when injured in an accident that wasn't your fault. Whether it's a car accident, slip, trip, or fall, or any other personal injury, Fielding Law is here to make sure you get the care, attention, and compensation you deserve. Fielding Law can assess the circumstances of the case, negotiate tenaciously with insurance companies, and if needed, file a lawsuit, and litigate to seek fair compensation on behalf of you, the injured party. An injury is a major disruption in your life. Medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, property damage, and other losses incurred as a result of the injury are part of the damages. Don't try and handle the process alone. You need an expert in the process. The team at Fielding Law are the ones to trust. Put Clark Fielding's number in your phone under the word accident. That number is 833-88-SHARK, 833-88-SHARK, or go to clarkthesharklaw.com. Mottek On Money continues here on 790 KBC. The Dow down nearly 400 points today, down 388 to 33,619. The S&P 500 down 64 at 4,274. And the NASDAQ tumbling 208 points back to 13,063. Worst day since March for the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Taking a look at the bond yields, they're skyrocketing. Right now, the yield in the 10-year note is up to 4.54%. That's the highest seen in 16 years since 2007, impacting fixed-rate mortgage rates out there. We'll be talking real estate shortly with one of the leading experts here locally. The price of oil, meanwhile, hovering back above $90 a barrel today, up 18 cents at $90.57 a barrel. At Southern California gas pumps, guess what? Prices are moving higher. Regular gas now averaging $6.14 a gallon in the L.A. Long Beach area. Looks like premium is up to $6.47 a gallon on average, and diesel now at $6.47 a gallon for truckers here in the Los Angeles area. In the crypto space, we see a Bitcoin right now up about $16 at 26,164. Ethereum up 4 at 1,590, and Doge at 6 cents. Now the latest news for you right here on 790 KBC. Mottek On Money continues here on 790 KBC. New readings on real estate today. The Commerce Department says new home sales down 8.7% in August. Here in Southern California, during the pandemic, we saw home sales booming on a foundation of low-lying interest rates. Now real estate professionals seeing the slowest market in about 35 years, according to a report out this week. With mortgage rates higher than 7%, Southern California home sales have fallen by almost half over the past couple of years. We're also seeing consumer confidence taking a hit, falling to a 4-month low in the month of September, reflecting angst about rising interest rates, still high inflation, and a budget stalemate in Washington, as well as, of course, what we've been mentioning, concerns about higher fuel prices. Cost of living certainly a big issue here, as we've seen during this hot labor summer, now extending into a hot labor autumn. Let's focus on real estate now. Let's get an update on what's happening here in this area with CURT NORTHRUP. CURT NORTHRUP leading the NORTHRUP Group at Compass in Beverly Hills, which specializes in luxury residential sales and investment. CURT, thank you very much for taking the call. It's been a while since we've chatted behind live microphones. Hope all is well with you. Give us your assessment of things here at the moment.
Frank, thank you so much for having me on. I mean, everything you just said leading up to this call is completely accurate. We're seeing a slowdown in sales across the board, less buyers, less sellers. Really what is the main catalyst here is the Fed waiting too long and more than doubling rates within a 12-month period. It's taking all of the equity out of a potential sale. It's scaring younger buyers who haven't seen these kind of rates. And it's just kind of, reinforcing the lack of consumer confidence in the overall market. Things are just moving very, very slowly. Different price points, you are seeing different inventory. The lower price point is very low inventory because there's not enough sellers, whereas the higher price point inventory is starting to get stacked up a little bit. So you might see a little softening there. But then we've got ULA, which is also, pushing back on any, higher end sales because of that tax as well. So there's just every factor in the market is working against the market right now. And, personally, I see that as policy decisions that have been made deliberately.
On the air live with CURT NORTHRUP with Compass in Beverly Hills. And CURT, let me ask you this regarding ULA, which was sold to the voters as a so-called mansion tax that was supposed to have taxed mansion transactions to help the homeless here, but it's impacted commercial real estate in a big way, right? And basically has removed pretty much all the profit incentive for a lot of these transactions. And there's an effort to try to get this overturned now. Tell us more about how ULA is impacting the real estate business here in the Los Angeles area.
Well, from what I understand, they haven't raised. I think they have to raise $150 million before they can even touch that money, and we're still a good 6 months to 9 months out before they'll have that much. So right now, it's having zero impact on the homeless situation, which is what the design was for, and it's really, dampening the markets across the board. Like you said, commercial real estate was already, kind of punched in the gut by COVID. And now you've got this on top. So with lowered prices and another tax, there's really no incentive for people to sell. You're seeing things just sit there. And this is what everyone was afraid of, the stagflation, where there's just no incentive for people to trade. And it's not just the owners and the buyers. You're talking about all the peripherals, too. You're talking about escrow companies and title companies and all the, real estate, brokers and agencies. Everybody is down at least 50% across the board. And, it's, until they change those rates, I just don't see it changing significantly.
What kind of transactions are you seeing these days? And what does it take to get a place in Beverly Hills nowadays, for example?
Well, Beverly Hills is an incorporated city, so you don't have to worry about ULA and Beverly Hills. That's one good thing about that. But the other part is what we are seeing with buyers is, if you want to buy something, now is the time to do it, because if you wait for rates to come back down to 4 or 5%, we're going to see once again, a dozen offers, all with the winner being all cash, no contingencies, and way over asking. So that's not a good situation for buyers to be in. Plus, the prices will probably pop a good 10 to 20%, in the first year or two as well. So if you're a buyer, I know it's scary to buy in at 7%, but you kind of want to date the rate and refi later, just so you don't have to swim with all the sharks.
So prices still holding up in the face of all this, or are prices starting to come down?
The post office has probably softened a little bit. Again, we've had enough inventory where we're starting to see wholesale pricing. You're seeing the good prices moving at a fair price, not too much off of value, whereas, anything that's overpriced or that's not as desirable is going to sit around longer. And those are the ones that are going to, have to make a bargain if they want to move. But we're not seeing distress sales yet. People aren't selling because they have to. I think that you're seeing sales of second homes and, maybe some, investment properties and things like that. And, people who are moving because they're downsizing or they're moving out of the country, the state. But it's not a fire sale quite yet. I think that our economy is going to get worse before it gets better. So I just think it's something to keep an eye on.
All right. And what about all this labor action here impacting, of course, all of Hollywood's been shut down for months now. Is that starting to have an impact on real estate? And what's the buzz on that?
A little bit. I mean, I've had a couple of clients that have sold just because they want to be cash. But I think a lot of people have been dipping into their savings, leaning on family, trying to weather the storm because they know it's going to eventually, hopefully subside at some point. And I think there's a lot of optimism that the next election cycle is going to help things. If people vote with their pocketbook, hopefully we can get some relief because it's honestly, it's been really boring. It's hard to get stuff done. There's a lot of cancellations. There's not a lot of conversations being had. So we're really going to, make the survival of the fittest. I mean, that's what we're seeing in the front line.
As we've discussed in the past, the fact is in Los Angeles area, all real estate is free. What you pay for is the weather. And I was reminded of this again. I was talking to some people in town from the UK this week, and the guy told me, he said, you can count on one hand how many nice days we have like this in London. So certainly we take it for granted, but it's certainly a real bonus to be in this beautiful environment here, and certainly we do pay for it. CURT, thank you very much for joining us live here tonight. That is CURT Northrup with the Northrup Group at Compass Realty Office in Beverly Hills, which specializes in luxury residential sales and investment. Hope to speak with you again soon, CURT, and all the best to you and your team there. Let's get right out to the freeways now. Here on 790 KABC. Friends, the future of joint pain relief is here. It's QC Kinetics, advanced regenerative medicine. This is amazing stuff. Frank Mottek here. Have you been told more steroids or surgery are your only options? Don't be so fast. Get a second opinion and learn more about how you can harness your body's own healing agents to attack that joint pain. I'm talking lasting relief. QC Kinetics doesn't mask the pain. These treatments go right to the very root of the problem, using concentrated healing properties placed directly in your joint to restore and repair that damaged joint tissue. Imagine living your life this fall with no more pain in your knees, hips, shoulders, or back. No drugs, no downtime, no surgery. Life's about motion, and QC Kinetics is giving people their lives back with these all-natural treatments. Call QC Kinetics for a free consultation, the nation's leader in regenerative medicine. QC Kinetics, locations in Glendale, the city of Orange, Mission Viejo, and now also in Costa Mesa. The number to call is 213-997-PAIN, 213-997-PAIN. Again, that's 213-997-PAIN. Mottek On Money continues here in 790 KABC. Rent will be due in a couple of days here. October 1st coming up fast. Meanwhile, eviction notices are piling up in the Los Angeles area, largely because of non-payment of rent. The amount of back rent owed to landlords in Los Angeles is going even higher. Let's get an update on what's happening with the rental situation out there. Daniel YUKELSON is with us live now, Executive Director of the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles. Thank you very much for taking the call and keeping us well informed on this big story here. Daniel YUKELSON, give us an update on what's happening with the evictions here in the Los Angeles area.
Well, thanks for having me on again, Frank. Well, the LA City Controller put out a report today that 186,000 eviction notices have been issued in the last 5 months or so. And, the problem is it's really a lot of inaccurate information. It's about what I would expect from a declared socialist controller. And it's really meant to be an attack on people that own rental properties, because the city controller has absolutely no respect for private property rights. And what these notices are is they're merely late payment notices. These are not eviction notices. You cannot evict somebody in California within 3 days. What it does is it does put renters on notice that you need to deal with your payment situation, and that you either need to cure the past due payment within 3 days, or you need to go to your property owner and work something out, work out a payment plan. But these are absolutely not eviction notices. In fact, many of them are duplicative. A lot of times these are sent to the renters in error. The city of LA has put some landmines on the 3-day notice that they require, and a lot of owners out there don't realize that you need to list the number of bedrooms. So they give the tenants these notices, and they find out later that they have to reissue them because they don't list the number of bedrooms on there. In addition, a lot of times the rent is cleared up within 3 days, and so these notices are just canceled. But those are still in the count by the city controller. And so it just trumps up the number of, so-called eviction notices, and they aren't quite eviction notices. Tenants have more time to pay and work things out with the rental property owners.
You think these the notices, maybe there should be some changes there? It's scary when somebody gets that thing taped on the door, pay rent or quit in 3 days, right? That's what they see. And so how does it work really in the real world here?
Well, that's true, Frank. And, I have concern if, I inadvertently forget to pay my credit card bill on time, and, I get a notice from my credit card company that I'm late, and there's all these penalties and interest that's built up on it. And the same thing, when you're late on your car payment, the car company, the lender, is not coming to repossess your car that day. It just doesn't happen. And in the real world in California, it could take up to 6 months to adjudicate an eviction case. And during that time, tenants typically are not paying their rent. Owners generally spend anywhere between $10,000 and $50,000, depending on how much the eviction case is contested in finalizing a case. And then once you do get an eviction declaration from a judge, it could take the sheriff's department 1 to 2 months in Los Angeles County just to do a lockout. So evictions are the last thing in the world owners want to go through. And invariably what happens is they end up paying their tenants a couple of $1,000s to whatever it takes, what we call cash for keys, to vacate the unit so they could rent to somebody who's going to be a little more responsible and pay the rent on time. And a lot of times tenants walk with a bunch of free rent and sometimes some money in their pocket when owners are faced with these problems. You've
kept us well informed about what's happening in the real world here, and certainly the small business people that have apartments or duplexes or whatever. Many of them, as you've noted, have been absolutely crushed in this environment where people haven't paid the rent and still aren't paying the rent, right? So what's happening out there? Are people throwing in the towel, or are big companies coming in and buying up these properties? We've heard about all the problems in commercial real estate, and this certainly adds this to the tally.
Well, that's absolutely what is happening, Frank. You know, we see it in our membership. We're losing a lot of the smaller independent owners that are just leaving the business, or they're selling their properties here in California and buying other investment properties in other states. And a lot of them are doing these tax-free exchanges for properties in other states, or, they're just, some of them, unfortunately, are losing their properties today due to foreclosure. They just can't keep up when they're owed so much rent. And, estimates in the LA area have been about $1 billion. There was a recent article in the Wall Street Journal that said about $1 billion of COVID-era debt was owed to rental property owners. And that doesn't even account for the approximately $3 billion our association has estimated that was lost in rent increases, because rent increases have been frozen this entire time. And then on top of that, we have rising interest rates as people have had to refinance their properties. They're getting crushed with these 7-8% interest rates that they have to bear, and they just can't afford to keep these properties anymore. And then, of course, we're the entertainment capital of the world, and the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild strikes have been a major problem. If you look at the zip codes that the city controller reported, a lot of these zip codes surround major production facilities and movie studios. And the people can't afford to pay their rent when they've been out of work for 3 or 4 months, like the writers and the actors have been.
Right. We're at a critical point, certainly here in Hollywood. And looks like, I don't know if you heard the beginning of the show this evening, but it looks like talks could soon resume here involving the actors and the producers. So hopefully there'll be some resolution there, and they're working out the final details on the writers' deal. So let me ask you this. Are rents coming up, or are they going up again, or are they coming down?
Well, they've kind of flatlined here in the LA area. In other areas outside of California, they continue to come down because major metropolitan areas are putting more rental units online. It's really a matter of supply, and we just cannot keep up with the supply because we have such punishing regulations, including Measure ULA, that people just don't have the appetite to build here in California anymore. And anything you see that's going up that has already been entitled well before Measure ULA has passed.
Right, and your association has taken on these policies. Any update on the court challenges?
We are still waiting for our first court hearing, and we're also waiting to hear what's happening with the U.S. Supreme Court, whether they're going to take up that New York landlord case. That's very important to us. That could start chipping away at some of these overbearing regulations we're forced to deal with here in California.
Daniel YUKELSON, thank you very much for that important update tonight. That is Daniel YUKELSON, the Executive Director of the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles, live with us here this evening on Mottek On Money on 790 KABC. Rough day for the stock market. Worst one-day tumble we've seen since March, with the Dow down 388 points at the closing bell today at 33,619. The S&P 500 slid 64 at 4,274. And the NASDAQ down 208 at 13,063. The yield on the 10-year note, which impacts fixed-rate mortgage rates out there, hitting a 16-year high today at 4.54%, the highest seen since 2007. We'll be back again tomorrow evening in the 5 o'clock hour. This is Mottek On Money on 790 KABC.
Mix a little sports analysis, pop culture, and great interviews, and you've got the Rich Eisen Show podcast.
Mike Florio, who's coaching for their gigs this year, do you think?
Brandon Staley, the Chargers, has to be. The way that they ended the 2022 season. And I think Robert Kraft put everyone on notice, including Bill Belichick, that it could be over. And Rich, every owner is thinking about the easy part is getting rid of the guy I have. The hard part is finding a guy who's as good or better.
The Rich Eisen Show podcast, wherever you listen.